They say the mind protects itself, that it seals away what it cannot carry. But the heart keeps no such records. It simply holds and waits and recognizes what the mind has forgotten. We begin. The file arrived on a Tuesday, which was already wrong. Hermione had learned in 4 years of working magical crimes to read the temperament of a case before she opened it. Urgent cases came by owl, parchment still warm from the sender's hands, the wax seal pressed in haste. Complicated cases came through the interdepartmental memo system, folded into sharp little aeroplanes that looped twice around her desk before landing, as if uncertain of their welcome. Cold cases came by hand, delivered by a junior clerk who wouldn't meet her eyes. This one arrived on her desk between one breath and the next. No sound, no owl, no paper aeroplane, no clerk. One moment the desk was empty. The next, the file was simply there, thick as a closed fist, bound in the ministry's standard burgundy cord, sealed with black wax instead of the usual red. The name on the front was written in a hand she didn't recognize. Her own. Hermione set down her tea. She looked at the file for a long moment without touching it, the way she might look at a potion whose label had been written in a language she almost knew. The handwriting was hers. She recognized the slant of the H, the way the G looped back on itself with slightly too much pressure. But she had no memory of writing it, and the ink had the deep, settled darkness of something that had dried weeks ago. She opened it anyway. She always opened things. The first page was a case summary. 3 deaths staggered across 6 weeks. The victims were listed by name. Aldous Renfrew, Senior Processor, Department of Magical Records. Callista Vane, Undersecretary to the Deputy Minister for Magical Integration. Percival Thatch, Independent Contractor, Ministry Adjacent, no permanent office. Cause of death in each case, complete mnemic collapse. Every memory extracted with surgical, ruthless precision, leaving behind a body that breathed and blinked and could not remember how to swallow. They had died of emptiness. Hermione read the page twice. She turned to the second page, which contained the preliminary evidence summary, and felt something cold settle at the base of her spine. The evidence was meticulous, thorough, organized in exactly the methodological sequence she herself had developed 3 years ago as a new standard for MCU casework. A sequence that existed only in her personal case manual and in the institutional memory of her team. At the bottom of the evidence page, beneath the summary of physical findings, was a single additional notation. It was written in the same hand as the cover. Her hand, again, but with a quality of urgency the cover had lacked. The letters slightly larger, pressed deeper into the parchment. Do not close this case before you understand why it was opened. She sat very still. Outside her office, the usual sounds of the Magical Crimes Unit continued without her. The scratch of quills, the percussive thud of a filing cabinet that had never closed properly. Someone down the corridor arguing in clipped, exhausted tones about jurisdiction. Normal sounds. The sounds of Tuesday. Hermione turned to the third page, where the lead investigator's name should have been assigned by the case intake office. Her own name looked back at her. She had not requested this case. She had not been briefed on it. She did not remember filing so much as a preliminary inquiry form. And Hermione Granger did not forget paperwork. She forgot birthdays occasionally, and once she had forgotten to eat for an entire day during a particularly demanding trial. But she had never in her professional life forgotten a document she had personally signed. She turned to the last page of the preliminary file. It was a photograph. Ministry standard, black and white, taken in what appeared to be an evidence room. Shelving units blurred in the background, a single examination table in the center. On the table, something she couldn't immediately identify. She looked closer. A cloak, dark fabric, draped with the particular careful stillness of something placed deliberately rather than discarded. She recognized it, not from the photograph, not from a case file, from the specific way the collar was folded back, exposing the inner lining, a habit she'd observed so many times in the past 3 months that she'd stopped consciously registering it, the way one stops registering a familiar piece of furniture. Draco Malfoy folded his collar back exactly like that, every time, without variation. Hermione closed the file. She opened it again immediately, because closing it hadn't helped, and she was not someone who benefited from avoidance. She looked at the photograph for another long moment, cataloguing details with the methodical attention that had always been her most reliable defense against panic. The table's examination markings, standard MCU issue. The shelving visible at the edge of the frame, labelled in the filing system her department used in room 11, sub-level 3. The faint shadow at the bottom left corner of the photograph that might, at a particular angle, be the edge of a second person's shoe. She pressed her thumb to the call bell on her desk. Her assistant, a young wizard named Thornwick, who had the unfortunate tendency to appear immediately and breathlessly, did exactly that. "Thornwick," Hermione said, keeping her voice at its usual register, measured, clear, the voice she used for depositions and difficult interviews, and moments when she needed the world to believe she was not standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. "I need the personnel file for Draco Malfoy. Consultant classification, active roster." Thornwick blinked. "Malfoy, Ma'am. Isn't he the one who... Personnel file, please, and the intake logs for this case." She touched the burgundy-bound file without looking at it. "I want to know who submitted it, when, and from which office." "Of course." Thornwick hesitated in the way that meant he had something to say and knew better than to say it. Will you be needing the consultant then? Only, his handler mentioned there's a note that he prefers." "Have him here by 9 tomorrow morning," Hermione said. "And Thornwick, the intake logs first." After he left, she sat alone with the file and the cold tea and the photograph of the cloak. She had met Draco Malfoy exactly 7 times since the war. She knew this because she had counted involuntarily the way one counts things that matter without deciding to. The first time had been at a post-war ministry reception she'd attended out of obligation and left early, and he'd been across a room that felt approximately as wide as a continent. He had not spoken to her. She had not spoken to him. But she'd been aware of him the way one is aware of a change in barometric pressure. Not visible, but registered in the body before the mind catches up. The second time had been a deposition, where he'd been a witness and she'd been observing counsel, and he'd answered every question with the precise minimum of words required and looked at nothing but the middle distance. The third had been a corridor, a near encounter that had resolved itself by both of them choosing opposite walls without acknowledgement, which had somehow felt more charged than a confrontation would have. The subsequent 4 times had all been since his appointment as ministry consultant 8 months ago. A meeting room, the evidence library, the atrium, twice. Each time accompanied by the same particular quality of atmospheric friction. Not hostility, not exactly, but the sensation of 2 unlike substances held in close proximity, neither dissolving into the other. She did not trust him. She was fairly certain he had spent the better part of their shared history not deserving trust. And yet, she looked at the photograph again, the cloak on the table, the careful fold of the collar. When Thornwick returned 20 minutes later with the intake log, Hermione read it twice, then set it flat on her desk and looked at it with the expression she normally reserved for evidence that actively contradicted itself. The case had been filed 6 weeks ago. The filing date matched the date of the first death. The submitted by line was blank, not empty, not unfilled, but specifically deliberately blank, as if something had been written there and then removed with a precision that left no ghost of ink, no impression on the parchment. The receiving clerk had signed for it. The intake stamp was legitimate, but the origin was gone. Someone had submitted this case from inside the ministry, using her name, using her case methodology, and then erased themselves from the record. Or she pressed her fingertips very lightly to the parchment. Or she had filed it herself and erased the memory of doing so. The tea had gone entirely cold by the time she acknowledged that second possibility. She acknowledged it the way she acknowledged most uncomfortable things, directly, with full attention, and with the expression of someone who will not permit themselves the comfort of looking away. She had worked with Obliviation cases before. She knew what a clean removal looked like. Not a gap exactly, nothing so crude as an absence you could point to. A clean removal felt like continuity. It felt like Tuesday morning, and a normal desk and a case file that had surely always been there. It felt, she thought, precisely like this. She gathered the file, tucked it under her arm with the photograph face down, and extinguished her desk lamp. Through the narrow window behind her chair, London's magical district glittered faintly in the early dark. Lamplight catching on rain-slick cobblestones 5 floors below, the world arranged in its usual order, indifferent to the particular quality of cold that had taken up residence somewhere behind her sternum. She needed to think. She needed, more urgently, to remember. And she suspected, with the slow, uncomfortable precision of someone whose mind had just begun pulling on a thread it hadn't consciously found, that by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning she would be sitting across a table from the one person in the ministry who might understand why his cloak was in an evidence room neither of them remembered entering. The lift doors closed behind her. In her office, on the desk she'd just left, the burgundy-bound file sat in the lampless dark. And at the very bottom of the front cover, in the same hand that had written her name, in ink so faint it was nearly invisible, readable only in the particular angle of a light that was no longer on. 2 words: find us. He was already there when she arrived. This was the first thing that unsettled her. Not dramatically, not with any outward sign, but in the way a room unsettles you when a piece of furniture has been moved 3 inches from where it always stood. Nothing wrong, precisely. Everything slightly, irrevocably off. Draco Malfoy stood at the window of the small conference room on sub-level 2, his back to the door, his hands clasped behind him, with the studied stillness of someone who had learned, at considerable personal cost, to appear as though he was not waiting. The room was one of the older ones, stone walls that predated the ministry's renovation by approximately 2 centuries. A table that listed faintly to the left, wall sconces that burned with a blue-white light slightly too cold to be comfortable. It smelled of old parchment and the particular mineral cold of deep stone, the kind of cold that had never been warm and never would be. He was wearing the cloak. Hermione stopped in the doorway. Just for a moment, half a second at most, not enough to constitute hesitation, certainly not enough for him to see. She set her files on the table with the decisive sound of someone who had not just spent 3 seconds staring at the specific fold of a collar. He turned at the sound. Granger. His voice was the same as she remembered it from depositions and corridors. Low, uninflected, stripped of the adolescent sneer it had once carried, and not replaced with anything warmer. Just the word, just her name, delivered with the economy of someone who believed that ornamentation was a form of vulnerability. Malfoy. She pulled out the chair at the head of the table without looking at him, opened the top file, uncapped her quill. The ritual of beginning. Thank you for coming. I wasn't given the option. No, she agreed. You weren't. She heard him move away from the window, the sound of the chair opposite being drawn back, not the chair closest to her, not the one farthest away, but the one directly across, which meant he was either indifferent to proximity or he'd made a deliberate choice she wasn't going to examine yet. The slight asymmetric weight of the table shifted as he settled into it. You've read the preliminary file, she said. This morning. A pause. It was on my desk when I arrived. She looked up. Someone left it for you. In the same way someone apparently left it for you. His grey eyes were level, attentive in the way that was different from the way she'd expected, not guarded so much as precise, cataloguing. Without any accompanying explanation or indication of origin. And your name is in it, as is yours. He tilted his head a fraction, which I found significantly more alarming than my own, given that you're the investigator of record and have no apparent memory of filing the case. The fact that he'd identified that detail, that he'd read the file carefully enough, quickly enough, to isolate the precise anomaly, produced a small involuntary recalibration in her chest. She was accustomed to working with colleagues who were competent. She was less accustomed to working with someone who read the way she read. What do you remember, she said, about the past 6 weeks? He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone evading. The quality was different, more inward, as if he were genuinely searching a space and reporting back on what he found. Normal consultancy work, he said finally. 2 cases with the Artifacts Division. A deposition for the Wizengamot subcommittee on Wednesday last. I reviewed the Blishwick estate inventory for the records department. He paused again. Nothing that intersects with your unit. Nothing that intersects with you. And yet. She turned the file to face him and pushed it across the table's listing surface. The photograph sat on top, the cloak, The examination table, the evidence room she couldn't place. "That's your cloak." He looked at it. She watched his face do something she couldn't immediately classify. Not recognition exactly, not denial. Something in between, a quality of interior stillness that preceded both. His jaw tightened slightly, one fractional degree, the way it might if he were pressing his back teeth together. "The collar," he said. "Yes." Another silence. He reached out and took the photograph, held it with both hands, studied it with an attention that excluded her entirely for approximately 30 seconds. "I don't remember this room," he said. "Neither do I. It should be room 11, sub-level 3, based on the shelving labels. I checked this morning." She waited. "It isn't." His gaze came back to her. "Meaning?" "Meaning room 11, sub-level 3, in its current configuration, does not match what's in that photograph. The shelving units are a different model. The examination table is an older issue. They were replaced 14 months ago." She kept her voice steady, clinical, the voice of someone building an evidentiary structure one stone at a time. "The room in that photograph doesn't currently exist, but it did exist. I pulled the renovation records." She slid another page across the table. He read it without picking it up. 18 months ago, he said. "The room was reconfigured 18 months ago. Whatever is in that photograph happened before the renovation, or in a space that was deliberately made to resemble the pre-renovation configuration." She paused. "Or the photograph itself was altered. I haven't ruled that out." "But you don't think it was?" It wasn't quite a question. She answered it anyway. "No, I don't think it was." He set the photograph down precisely where it had been, returned it to her. She noticed that he'd handled it carefully, not with the delicacy of someone unused to evidence, but with the specific care of someone who understood that objects held information in ways that extended beyond their visible surfaces. 3 victims, he said. All MCU adjacent. The methodology on the memory extractions. You recognized it. It matches a technique documented in 2 restricted texts in the Department of Mysteries library, Hermione said. And in my own personal casebook, which is not a restricted text, but which is also not available to anyone outside my immediate team. And yet, it matches. With one variation I've never published and never discussed. A modification I developed 18 months ago and haven't used in an active case. The blue-white light of the sconces pressed down between them. Draco's hands were flat on the table now, very still, and she found herself registering the silver ring on his right hand, a Malfoy signet, worn with the crest facing inward in the manner of someone who hadn't yet decided what their family name meant to them now. "You think we did this?" he said. "I think the evidence currently suggests we were present," she said carefully. "I think the evidence suggests we had access to information that should not have been accessible to anyone involved in these deaths. I think the timeline has significant gaps that correspond to windows of time I cannot fully account for." She squared the corners of her files with one precise motion. "I am not prepared to conclude anything further until I have examined the primary evidence. But," she looked at him directly, "but I think we need to know what we were doing 18 months ago before someone else tells us." Something moved through his expression then. Not fear, she thought, but adjacent to it. the look of someone who has just felt the ground alter beneath a foot that hadn't finished landing. He covered it quickly with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent a great portion of his life learning to cover things quickly. But she'd been watching, and she'd seen the half-second of it. "You think we obliviated ourselves," he said. "I think it's a possibility we can't dismiss. To hide evidence, to hide something," she paused, "or to protect it." The distinction hung between them. He heard it. She could see that he heard it, in the slight shift of his posture, the way his gaze steadied on her face. "There's a difference," he said slowly, "between hiding evidence of a crime and concealing a reason for one." "Yes," she said, "there is." She gathered the photograph and replaced it in the file. Outside the stone walls, the ministry moved in its usual rhythms, distantly audible, absolutely indifferent. In here, the silence had a different texture, close, specific, threaded through with the kind of unspoken acknowledgement that neither of them had extended to the other in any of their previous 7 encounters. They were the same kind of frightened. That was what the silence said, underneath everything else. Hermione had not expected that. She had expected resistance, or professional cool, or the particular brand of controlled contempt he'd always managed to make look effortless. She had not expected him to sit across a listing table in a cold stone room and simply look at her, not through her, not past her, at her. The way someone looks at a thing they're trying to understand rather than a thing they're trying to defeat. "We need access to the evidence room," she said, because she was better at moving than at being looked at. "The actual room, whatever its current configuration, and I want the ministry's legilimency consultant to run a preliminary scan on both of us, to check for modified memories, to establish a baseline." She stood. "If someone has been inside our heads, I want to know before we dig further." He rose with her. Across the table, at his full height, he was, she'd registered this before, in corridors, in the atrium, taller than she tended to remember when she was not standing near him. There was something in the proximity, in the close air of the small room, that made her suddenly and acutely aware of the exact amount of space between them. Not uncomfortable, not comfortable. The particular charged quality of a precise and careful distance. "Granger." His voice was quiet, stripped of everything that wasn't the question itself. "If it turns out we did this, if we find the memory and it shows us something neither of us wants to see, then we see it anyway," she said. "That's the only way through." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up his copy of the file and moved toward the door, and she followed a half-step behind, and the blue-white sconces burned on in the empty room behind them, and neither of them spoke in the lift, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of two unlike substances held in careful separation. It had become something else, something that had weight and warmth and the faint, persistent quality of a question that had been asked without words and had not yet, quite, been answered. The evidence room was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately name. Hermione stood in the doorway of room 11, sub-level 3, and let her eyes move across it with the slow, methodical attention she gave to crime scenes. Not looking for anything specific yet, just receiving, cataloguing, allowing the space to present itself before she imposed a framework on it. The shelving units, the examination table, current model, pale wood and steel brackets, the overhead lights, standard ministry issue, buzzing faintly at a frequency just below conscious irritation. The smell of preservation charms and old cardboard, and the faint ozone bite of recently discharged spellwork. Nothing overtly wrong, nothing that would appear in a report. And yet, she had been in this room perhaps 40 times over 4 years of MCU work. She knew its dimensions the way she knew the layout of her own flat. Not consciously, not in numbers, but in the body. The specific distance between the door and the first shelving unit. The way sound moved in here, slightly dampened by the preservation charms on the archived materials, giving every footstep a muffled interior quality. Today, the room felt smaller, not measurably, not in any way she could point to. But the air had a different pressure against her skin, and the distance from the door to the first shelf felt shorter by some fraction that her body registered and her mind could not confirm. As if the room remembered being a different size, or as if she did. Draco came in behind her. She heard him stop just inside the door, and there was a pause, brief, telling, before he moved further in. He'd felt it too. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. "The shelving configuration," he said. His voice was low, calibrated to the room's acoustics with the unconscious precision of someone with an acute sensitivity to space. In the photograph, the second unit from the left had a lower top shelf. Hermione turned to the second unit. Adjusted during the renovation, the original shelves were lower, pre-standardization, older hardware. She ran one finger along the current top shelf, which sat approximately 8 inches higher than the one in the photograph. They raised the units and restocked. Anything that was archived here 18 months ago would have been relocated. Where? That's what I spent yesterday evening finding out. She opened her case file on the examination table, the current table, not the older one in the photograph, though the placement was identical, and extracted a requisition record. Archive relocation log. Everything from this room was moved to deep storage on sub-level 6 during the renovation. 43 boxes. Standard relocation, standard logging. She paused. Except for one discrepancy. She placed the log on the table between them. He leaned in to read it, close enough that she caught the scent of him. Something faintly resinous, cedar perhaps, underlaid with the cold stone smell of the ministry that clung to everyone who spent too much time below ground. His presence beside her had a particular quality she'd been studiously not categorizing since yesterday morning. A kind of atmospheric specificity, the way certain objects in a room make you aware of them without being prominent. "Box 31, he said. "Box 31, she confirmed. "Logged in, never logged out of deep storage. But when I sent Thornwick down this morning, it wasn't there. The slot was there. The record of its existence was there. The box itself." She pulled a second document from the file. Gone. No transfer record, no destruction order, no checkout log. She let him look at it. Someone removed box 31 from deep storage without generating any paperwork, which in a ministry archive is either impossible or requires a level of access I can count on one hand. He straightened. He was looking at the space where the lower shelf had been, at the current shelf, but through it somehow, at the configuration that no longer existed. What was in it? The relocation manifest lists it as miscellaneous archived materials from an active investigation, reference number redacted. She kept her voice even. The reference number field was manually overwritten. Ink on ink. Someone physically altered a ministry archive log. Recently. The overwriting ink is newer, within the past 2 years. She closed the file, which places it after the renovation and before now. Draco was quiet for a moment. He moved away from the table toward the second shelving unit and stood there with his back to her, looking at the current configuration, and she watched the line of his shoulders, the way they held their tension, not rigidly, but with a kind of wary, coiled stillness, as if he were a structure under continuous low-grade load. "The legitimacy scan," he said. "Addison from the mystery department. Tomorrow morning, separately." She had arranged it before leaving the office last night, lying awake afterward with the precise consciousness of someone whose thoughts would not cue politely. She'll compare baseline memory structure against any evidence of modification. If there are gaps, shaped gaps, the kind that Obliviation leaves, she'll find them. And if she does, then we know the shape of what's missing. Hermione came to stand beside him, not beside exactly, a meter away, facing the same shelf. Sometimes you can work backward from the outline. He turned his head fractionally toward her. In profile, in the buzzing overhead light, there was something about his face that she hadn't had occasion to look at directly before. The sharpness of it. Yes, she'd always registered that. But underneath the sharp architecture, there was something else. A quality of strain that wasn't fresh. Something that had been there long enough to become structural. "I had a dream last night," he said. The directness of it, the absence of preamble, the simple declarative weight of it, made her go still. "Not a dream exactly," he continued in the same quiet register. "More like pressure, a sensation of a room I couldn't see. Stone floor, the smell of something burning that wasn't fire." He paused. "And your voice." Hermione's hands, which had been resting loosely at her sides, moved involuntarily. Her right hand found the hem of her jacket and pressed it flat, a brief, reflexive smoothing of fabric that had no wrinkles. "What was I saying?" she asked. "I don't know. I couldn't hear the words, only the register of it, the way you sound when you've decided something." He looked back at the shelf. Certain, frightened underneath the certainty. She absorbed this. She absorbed it the way she absorbed difficult evidence, without recoiling, without rushing to interpretation, holding it in the careful space between reception and response. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally. It cost her something to say it, though she couldn't have specified exactly what. "Not a dream. But when I did sleep, I kept reaching for something. A file, I thought. But when I looked down, it wasn't a file." "What was it?" The overhead light buzzed. Somewhere deeper in the archive, a preservation charm cycled and clicked. "I don't know," she said. "I woke up before I could see it." The honesty of the exchange sat between them, fragile and improbable. The kind of thing that should not have been possible between them. Not here, not with the specific shared history that preceded this room and this investigation and whatever it was they apparently could not remember. And yet, here it was, existing without permission. He moved then, not toward her, just a shift of his weight, a turning of his body from the shelf to the room at large, and she turned with him by some reflex she didn't examine, and for a moment they both faced the examination table, the empty table, the room that remembered being different. "I want to see the victim's files," he said. "Not the summary. The full case files, scene photographs, healer's reports, the exact spell work analysis. I had them pulled this morning." She went to the table and opened the second folder she'd brought. Thicker, heavier, divided by coloured tabs she'd added at 2 in the morning, with the focused irrelevance of someone who needed her hands occupied. Renfrew first. He was the earliest. Draco came to the table. He stood on the opposite side, which meant the table was between them, which meant she could look at the documents and be aware of him across them without having to manage the particular issue of proximity. Reasonable, professional, exactly what this was. She opened the Renfrew file to the scene photographs. They both went still. The stillness was not simultaneous. His came a half-second after hers, which meant he'd seen what she'd seen, and it had landed in him the same way it had landed in her, a drop into cold water, breathless and sudden. She heard rather than saw his intake of breath, brief, controlled, but present. The scene photograph showed a small office, standard ministry furniture, the featureless sameness of mid-level administrative spaces. Renfrew was in his chair, eyes open, the expression of someone interrupted mid-thought and never permitted to complete it. That wasn't what had stopped her. On the desk in front of him, arranged with a precision that bore no resemblance to the chaos of an assault, and every resemblance to a deliberate message, were 3 objects: a quill, a silver ring, a single page of parchment, blank, edges squared. Hermione knew the quill. She knew it with the intimate certainty of an object handled daily, the particular worn place on the barrel where her index finger rested, the replacement nib she'd fitted herself because the original had been slightly misaligned. It was her quill. Her office quill, the one she'd assumed she'd misplaced 6 weeks ago and replaced without significant concern. And the ring. She made herself look at Draco's hands, flat on the table, the requisition documents between them. His right hand, the signet ring, crest facing inward. She looked at the photograph. The ring in the photograph was the same. She raised her eyes to his. He was already looking at her. Had been looking at her, she thought, since the moment he'd seen it. Watching her face go through its careful, controlled sequence of registrations, giving her time to arrive where he had already arrived. "We were in that room," she said. Not a question, not an accusation. Simply the fact, arriving at last and asking to be stood beside. "Yes," he said. The single syllable carried something she hadn't heard from him before. Not guilt, exactly. Guilt was too simple, too self-directed. This was something with more dimension. The sound of a person who has just seen a door they don't remember closing and finds it, despite everything, despite all sensible reservation, a relief that someone else is standing at it too. Hermione looked back at the photograph. Her quill, his ring, the blank page arranged with the geometric care of people who do things on purpose. She thought about what Draco had said. Certain. Frightened underneath the certainty. Yes, she thought. That sounded right. That sounded with a precision that made the back of her neck prickle. Exactly right. She closed the file. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Addison. Both of us. He nodded. He picked up his copy of the documents, aligned the edges, tucked them under his arm in a motion she had already, without intending to, learned to recognize. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. Granger. He didn't turn fully, just enough that she could see the line of his jaw, the set of his mouth. Whatever we find, whatever we were doing in that room, we find it together, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned fully and looked at her across the length of the room, across the examination table and the archived silence, and the 6 weeks of whatever it was they couldn't yet see. Together, he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. It held. He left. Hermione stood alone in the room that remembered being different, her quill's ghost in a crime scene photograph, and pressed her fingers flat against the examination table. The surface was cool and very real. She pressed harder, grounding herself in its solidity, in the present tense of the physical world. Beneath her sternum, something that had been very tightly closed for a very long time shifted on its hinges. Just slightly, just enough to let in a sliver of cold air. Or perhaps, she thought, and did not allow herself to think further, something warmer than cold. The legilimency scan took 47 minutes. Hermione knew this because she counted. Not the seconds, she wasn't that far gone, but the slow, deliberate progressions of the wall clock in Addison's anteroom, each minute marked by a soft, mechanical click that she felt in her back teeth by the end of it. She sat in the chair provided, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, with the careful stillness of someone who has decided that stillness is the only form of control currently available to her. Addison was a small woman, 60s, with a particular quality of attention that long-practiced legilimens developed. A gaze that rested on you without pressing, that managed to be both entirely present and entirely undemanding. She had said very little before beginning. She had said even less during. What she said after was this: there are gaps. Hermione had known. She had known before sitting in the chair, before the soft lateral pressure of Addison's passive scan had moved through her like a tide through a known coastline, finding the places where the shore had been reshaped. She had known in the evidence room yesterday, looking at her quill in a crime scene photograph. She had known, if she was honest with herself, and she was always honest with herself, it was practically a character defect. Since the moment she'd first opened the burgundy file and felt the particular seamless continuity of a Tuesday morning that had been assembled for her rather than lived. But knowing and being told were different things. How many? She said. 3 distinct modifications. Addison set down her noting quill with the care of someone who understood that the next words needed space around them. They're clean. Whoever performed them was exceptionally skilled. The integration work is nearly invisible. If you weren't looking specifically for shaped absences, you'd find nothing. She paused. But you can feel them, can't you? You've been feeling them. Like a word on the tip of your tongue, Hermione said. Except it's not a word. It's a larger shape. Yes. Addison nodded. That's what a well-executed removal feels like from the inside. The mind knows something belongs there. It keeps returning to the outline. She folded her hands on the desk. The 3 gaps correspond to specific time windows. I can give you the dates. She gave her the dates. Hermione wrote them in her casebook without allowing her hand to change its pace. The first date was 6 weeks ago, the night before Renfrew's body was found. The second was 4 weeks ago. The third, 2 weeks past. 1 gap per death. She thanked Addison. She left the anteroom and stood in the corridor outside with her casebook open to the page she'd just written, and did not move for approximately 30 seconds. Around her, the Ministry's sub-level 2 flowed past. Footsteps, voices, the distant clatter of interdepartmental memos finding their recipients. No one looked at her. She was simply a woman standing in a corridor with an open notebook, which in the Ministry was unremarkable. She closed the notebook and went to find Draco. He was in the corridor already. Of course he was. His session had presumably ended before hers, given the shorter wait she'd observed when she arrived. He was standing near the far wall, not leaning against it, but close to it, with the posture of someone who has recently received information and is in the process of deciding what to do with his face. He looked up when he heard her approach. Whatever he'd decided to do with his face was this: nothing. He looked at her with the most unguarded expression she had seen from him yet, which was not, by most standards, particularly unguarded, but which represented, she was beginning to understand, a considerable offering from him. 3 gaps, she said. 3 gaps, he confirmed. Corresponding dates. She showed him her notebook. He looked at the dates and then produced from his jacket's inner pocket a folded piece of paper on which he'd written 3 dates in his own hand, the spare, slightly angular script she'd seen in the case consultation notes. She looked at his dates and then at hers. Identical. They stood in the corridor with their respective pieces of paper, and the weight of what identical dates meant settled between them like a third presence. "Same nights," she said. "Both of us. The same windows. We were together." He said it with the same quality she'd used yesterday. Not question, not accusation, simply the fact. All 3 times. Yes. He folded his paper with precise movements and returned it to his pocket. Addison said the modifications on mine were performed by 2 people, one working from outside, one, she thinks, self-administered, simultaneously. He paused. She said she'd only seen that technique once before, in a theoretical paper from the Department of Mysteries. Hermione's breath moved carefully in and out. "I wrote that paper," she said. 4 years ago. It was theoretical, a framework for understanding cooperative obliviation, 2 practitioners modifying each other's memories in synchrony to ensure consistency of removal. She stopped. "It requires absolute trust between the practitioners. Any mistrust, any withheld intention, and the modification fractures, leaves traces. And ours left none. The specific weight of that, she felt it in her chest, not painfully, but with the particular pressure of something true pressing against a space that had been holding a different shape. "None," she said. The Ministry corridors moved around them. Somewhere a memo collided with a ceiling lamp and spiraled in an agitated loop. The air smelled of stone and old parchment, and the faintly metallic residue of a dozen active spells. "I want to go back to sub-level 6, Draco said. "The deep storage. Box 31 is gone, but the slot isn't. Physical spaces hold, impressions, residual spell signatures. If we were down there, handling materials, working..." "There may be traces," Hermione said. "Yes, I was thinking the same thing." He looked at her. The look had a particular quality that she was running out of language for. Not warmth, not yet, not exactly, but the quality of attention that warmth is made of. The quality of someone looking at another person and finding, unexpectedly, that the looking is not a burden. "Were you?" he said, quietly, not mockingly. "I usually am," she said. And then, because something in the air of the corridor made precision feel less like armor and more like simple truth. "Thinking the same thing as you. Since yesterday, I find it disconcerting," he offered. "I was going to say surprising. That's a kinder word for it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The infrastructure of one. The suggestion that the architecture existed. Sub-level 6, then. They took the lift together. It was a small lift, ministry standard, designed for two people standing at a professionally comfortable distance, which meant that two people who were not entirely comfortable with each other's proximity were required to manage it without the benefit of physical space as a buffer. Hermione faced the doors. Draco stood beside her. The lift descended. She was aware of him the way she'd been aware of him in the evidence room. That specific atmospheric quality, neither intrusive nor distant, simply present, like a change in air pressure you couldn't locate in any single direction. His left arm was an inch from her right arm. She didn't look at it. She was very precisely not looking at it, which she recognized as its own form of looking. "You said the technique requires absolute trust," he said. The lift continued its descent. "Between practitioners." "Yes, that's..." He stopped. She felt the pause as a physical thing. 18 months ago. We had not spoken, Granger. Not in any meaningful sense. No. So whatever we were doing, whatever brought us to those 3 rooms on those 3 nights, it preceded..." He stopped again. "Something happened between then and now that I also don't remember. Not a gap. Something that grew in the gaps." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the lift doors, at their reflection in the polished metal, which gave her his profile and a version of his face that was slightly abstracted, slightly more accessible for the distance the reflection created. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving through some interior calculation she couldn't read. "We trusted each other," she said. "Whatever we were doing, whatever reason we had, we trusted each other enough to stand in a room together and remove the evidence of it from our own minds. That's significant," he said. "I was going to say extraordinary." The corner of his mouth moved again. This time it completed itself, briefly, almost involuntarily, there and then managed back into neutrality. But she'd seen it. She filed it in the same careful space where she'd been filing all the things about him that didn't fit the architecture she'd constructed years ago. The lift arrived at sub-level 6 with a soft terminal click. Deep storage was colder than the floors above it, the kind of cold that lived in stone and never left, that predated the building around it and would outlast it. The lighting was sparser here, low lumos equivalent fixtures every 10 meters, casting pools of pale light separated by genuine shadow. The smell was different from the archive above, less parchment, more mineral, the iron-cold scent of very old walls, and the faint, specific residue of preserved spellwork left to age in the dark. They moved through the rows without speaking. Their footsteps were quiet on the stone floor, not silent. The stone was too hard for that, but the sound was absorbed quickly by the high shelving units crowding in on either side. Hermione counted the aisle markers. 7, 12, 19, row 23, section B, slot 31. The slot was present. The box was not. A rectangular absence on the shelf, slightly darker than the surrounding stone where the box had shielded it from whatever minimal light reached this far. Hermione crouched before it and held her wand up, performing a slow reveal charm. Not a specific spell, but the general diagnostic she used when looking for spell residue, the magical equivalent of developing a photograph. The air around the slot shimmered faintly. "There," Draco said, very quietly behind her. He'd crouched too. She could hear it in his voice, the different angle of it, and he was close, closer than she'd realized, looking past her shoulder at the faint shimmer her charm had revealed. "Preservation work," she said. "Recent-ish. And..." She moved the wand slightly, adjusting the diagnostics angle. "Something else. A concealment charm of some kind, layered. And underneath that..." The shimmer resolved briefly into something with shape, the ghost of a handprint on the edge of the shelf above the slot, too large to be hers. She turned her head. Draco was directly behind her, close enough that the motion brought them into sharp proximity, his face level with hers, separated by a distance she could feel rather than measure. His eyes were on the handprint. Then they moved to hers. "That's mine," he said. "Yes." "We were here." "Yes." His gaze held hers for a moment that had a different quality than the silences before it. Less clinical, less structured, stripped of the procedural scaffolding they'd been using to manage the specific difficulty of each other. She became very aware of her own breathing, of his, of the minimal, charged space between them. Then he stood and offered his hand. Not gesturally, literally, a physical offer, his hand extended to help her up from her crouch. She looked at it for half a second. She took it. His hand was cooler than she'd expected, and more certain, and the grip brief and unambiguous, releasing her cleanly once she was standing. But for the duration of it, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, it was the most honest contact they had made, and it moved through her with a clarity that had nothing to do with the investigation. She straightened her sleeve cuffs. "There's something in the slot," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "Behind where the box was. The shimmer is coming from the back wall." She reached in. Her fingers found the back panel of the shelf, pressed, and found a seam where no seam should be. A hollow space behind it, small, the size of a large envelope. She extracted what was inside. A sealed envelope, her name on the front, and below her name, in the same hand that had written, "Find us," on the bottom of the case file cover. "Don't open this until you remember why you sealed it. You'll know when." She stood in the cold dark of sub-level 6 with the envelope in her hands and felt the outline of the missing thing pressing against her from the inside. Closer now, much closer. Beside her, Draco was very still. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, the minimal, specific warmth of a person standing close in a cold place. And she held the envelope and did not open it, because she understood, with a certainty that bypassed all her usual requirement for evidence, that she was not ready yet. But she was closer. They both were. She did not sleep that night either. This was becoming a pattern she refused to name, because naming it would require acknowledging what was at its center. Not the case, not the gaps, not the sealed envelope she'd locked in the top drawer of her desk with a containment charm, and then stood staring at for 4 minutes before making herself leave. Those things kept her mind occupied. What kept her awake was something quieter and more inconvenient. The specific, persistent recollection of Draco Malfoy's hand closing around hers in a cold archive, certain and brief, and the way it had felt less like assistance and more like recognition. She was at her desk by 6:30. The envelope was still in the drawer. She did not open the drawer. By 7, she had laid out everything they had across the length of her office floor. Case photographs, archive logs, Addison's written summary of the scan results, the relocation manifest, the scene photographs from all 3 victims. She sat in the middle of it, cross-legged, in the manner she'd adopted as a student when a problem required full spatial immersion, and looked at the whole of it at once. The ministry building was nearly empty at this hour. Through the narrow window, the sky was the deep, uncertain blue of very early morning, not yet dawn, the city below still gathered in its nighttime quiet. She looked at the 3 victims in their scene photographs: Renfrew, Vane, Thatch. She had run their backgrounds yesterday evening methodically, the way she ran all backgrounds, not looking for anything specific, looking for everything, letting the picture assemble itself. What had assembled itself was this. All 3 had worked at various points and in various capacities in the Department of Magical Records. Not simultaneously, their tenures overlapped in irregular patterns like a badly shuffled deck. But all 3 had held access at specific periods to the restricted archive of Muggle-born registration records. Records that should have been sealed after the war. Records that she had discovered at 11 o'clock the previous night with the specific, nauseating clarity of a thing becoming visible, had been accessed repeatedly in the 18 months prior to the first death. Accessed, cross-referenced, and, she was nearly certain, pending confirmation she hadn't yet been able to obtain, sold. She sat with this knowledge on the floor of her office, surrounded by the evidence of something she suspected she had already known once, and felt the shape of the missing thing press closer. The door opened at 7:43. She knew his footsteps now. She'd learned them without deciding to, the particular weight and pace of them, the way they had a quality of deliberateness that stopped short of heaviness. She did not look up immediately. She gave herself the 3 seconds of looking at the photograph of Vane's office before she turned, which was enough time to arrange her expression into something that was not the specific, complicated thing it wanted to be. Draco stood in the doorway with 2 cups from the ministry canteen, one in each hand, steam rising from both, and looked at the floor around her without any visible surprise, as if he had entirely expected to find her sitting in the middle of an evidence constellation at 7:45 in the morning, as if this was simply a thing she was. He stepped carefully between the documents and set 1 cup beside her. Then he crouched at the edge of the layout, looking at its overall shape the way she had been looking at it, not at individual pieces, but at the whole, at the spatial logic of how she'd arranged it. "Victims are clustered here," he said, touching the air above the 3 scene photographs, without touching the photographs themselves. "Archive materials here. timeline running this direction. He followed the line of dates she'd arranged left to right. And you've put the scan results at the center. The gaps are the center of everything, she said. Every other piece of evidence orbits them. He picked up his own cup and looked at the scan results summary. He'd changed since yesterday. Different jacket, same quality of careful, considered dress, as if he'd thought about it. She noticed this and filed it in the place she was increasingly running out of room in. I spent last night on the victim's financial records, he said. Consultant access. I had to go through 2 layers of authorization, which took until midnight. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded page. He leaned across the evidence layout to hand it to her, and the motion brought him close. Close enough that she could see the faint shadow of sleeplessness beneath his eyes that matched her own. She unfolded the page. Renfrew received 17 irregular payments over 14 months, he said. All routed through a shell account in the Gringotts auxiliary system. The amounts varied, small enough individually to avoid standard flagging, large enough collectively to indicate serious compensation. He indicated a column of figures. Vane received 11 payments through a different route, a charitable foundation that does not appear to have any charitable activities. Thatch was paid directly in cash in the way of someone who knew the system well enough to fear it. Hermione looked at the figures. Paid for what? I think you know. She set the page down carefully in its logical place within the floor layout. The registration records, she said. They were selling access, names, addresses, magical signatures. She paused. To whom? That I don't know yet. The payment trails end at the shell accounts and go dark. He looked at the layout. But I think we knew. I think we found this. Some version of this. And we decided not to wait for official channels. Because official channels would have taken months, she said. And every week of delay. More names, more access, more damage. He was quiet for a moment. I understand the logic. She looked at him. Do you? He met her gaze. There was something in his expression that was neither deflection nor performance. Just a person looking at another person across a shared and complicated thing. My name is in those records, he said. Draco Malfoy, pure blood, registered. My family submitted those records voluntarily under the previous regime as proof of status. He paused. But there are Muggle-born names in the same archive. People who were registered against their will, under threat. People who had no choice. He looked away at some middle distance beyond the window. I know what it means for those names to be sold. I know what someone would do with that information. The morning light was coming now, thin, pale, winter qualified, pressing through the narrow window and laying itself in strips across the evidence on the floor. In it, Hermione could see the fine dust motes turning, could see the slight tension in Draco's profile, the way he was holding something back, not from her, but from himself. Your name is in those records, she said quietly, and you still cared what happened to the others. He looked back at her. Don't make that into something, he said, but without heat, without the old armor, just the words, honest and slightly raw at the edges. I'm not, she said. I'm simply noting it. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the floor. We need to talk about what we did, he said. Not what the evidence suggests. What it means that we chose to seal it, that we chose to forget. I've been thinking about that. She wrapped both hands around her cup. The technique I described, cooperative obliviation, it isn't only about trust between practitioners. It requires a shared intention. Both people have to want the same thing to be gone. If one of you is uncertain, the modification won't integrate. She paused. We both wanted to forget. Or we both decided to, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him. He was right. She hadn't separated those two things, and he had, immediately, and the precision of it, moved through her like a small, specific shock. We decided to, she said, which means we had reasons, which means somewhere in what we did, there was something we knew we couldn't carry and also couldn't share. A third option. He stood, setting his cup down on the edge of her desk, and moved to look at the scene photographs more closely. Not hiding it from others, hiding it from ourselves, specifically. He looked at the photograph of Renfrew's desk, the quill, the ring, the blank page. We left markers, your quill, my ring, a blank page, which I think is the most deliberate of the three. A blank page in the place of a written record, Hermione said. She stood too, because the idea was pulling her upright. We removed whatever was written and left the blankness as an indication of the removal itself. We were documenting the gap. We were leaving instructions, he said, for ourselves. We knew we'd come back to this. We built the case so we'd have to. The realization settled over her with the particular complex weight of something true and terrible, and, underneath both of those, something that felt unexpectedly like the architecture of care. They had trusted their future selves to be ready for what their past selves couldn't carry. They had built a map home from inside a maze they were about to forget. She picked up the photograph of Renfrew's desk and held it. The quill, the ring, the blank page. The envelope, she said. Draco looked at her. The one I found in sub-level 6. She set the photograph down. I think I'm ready. She opened the top drawer. The containment charm dissolved at her touch, recognizing her magical signature the way all good containment charms did, tuned to the person who cast it, which confirmed, if any further confirmation was needed, that she had placed it there herself. She broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page. She unfolded it. Draco came to stand beside her, not behind her this time, not across a table, but beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm along her own, close enough to read the same words at the same moment. The handwriting was hers. The words were addressed to both of them. If you're reading this together, you're further along than we thought you'd be willing to get. That's something. What you did was not a crime. What you stopped was. The evidence is in the box. The box is not where it should be. We moved it. You'll find it where the first thing you ever agreed on is. You'll know what that means when you remember. And you will remember now. That's why we built the case the way we did. Not to expose yourselves, to give yourselves permission to come back to it. There is one more thing you need to know. Something that happened in that room, between the doing of the necessary thing and the forgetting of it. Something neither of us sealed away because neither of us could stand to. You already know what it is. You've been knowing it since Tuesday morning. Stop being careful with it. The letter ended there. Hermione stood with the page in her hands, and the morning light crossing the floor between the evidence and the window, and she was aware, with absolute and undefended precision, of Draco beside her, of the exact distance, or absence of it, between his arm and hers, of his breathing, which had changed, of her own, which had too. She turned her head. He was already looking at her, not the way he'd looked at her across tables and through lift reflections, and over the carefully managed distances of professional proximity. Without the distance, with the expression she'd seen the ghost of for days now, assembled at last into its complete form, something open and frightened and certain, all three at once, which she recognized because she suspected her own face was doing the same thing. "The first thing we agreed on," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Do you know what that is?" She did. She knew it the way the letter said she would, not as a memory recovered, but as a memory that had never been removed, sitting in her chest since Tuesday morning, waiting. "The case was wrong," she said. "When I first opened the file, something felt wrong, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought whoever built this understood exactly how I think." "I had the same thought," he said. "When my copy arrived, I thought this was made by someone who anticipated every question I'd ask, every direction I'd look." He paused. "And then I thought, there's only one other person I know who thinks in exactly this pattern." They looked at each other. The morning light moved. Somewhere in the building below them, the ministry was beginning its day. The distant percussion of it, the ordinary life of an institution utterly indifferent to the specific, unprecedented thing happening in a small office on the 5th floor. "We built it together," she said. "We built it together," he confirmed. The space between them had been narrowing since Tuesday. She understood now. Not dramatically, not with any single decisive movement, but with the slow, inexorable patience of a tide that knows where it's going. This was where it had been going. This moment, in the winter morning light, with the evidence of 6 weeks of careful construction spread across her floor, and the letter in her hands, and the certainty, quiet and enormous, that the thing she'd been knowing since Tuesday was not a mistake. His hand found hers, not the brief, functional grasp of the archive. Something different, deliberate, unhurried, his fingers closing around hers with the quality of a decision made and committed to. She felt her own hand respond before she'd consciously chosen, turning in his, the contact warm and steady, and startlingly, completely right. She looked down at their joined hands, and then up at his face. "We should find the box," she said, because she was still herself, and she was not built for surrender without direction. "We should," he agreed. His thumb moved once across her knuckle. "But Granger—" "I know," she said. She did know. That was the thing. She knew with the same certainty she gave to evidence and proof and things that could be demonstrated, which was, she was discovering, the most solid kind of certainty she had. She held his hand and looked at the floor full of evidence and felt the sealed thing in her chest open another degree, and the air that came through it was not cold at all. The first thing they had ever agreed on was a library, not metaphorically, not the abstract concept of one, an actual, specific library, small and poorly lit, and technically not authorized for use by either of them, tucked into the eastern corner of sub-level 4 in the section of the ministry building that predated the current structure by 300 years. Hermione had discovered it in her second year at MCU, following a misrouted memo down a corridor that dead-ended in a door that had no business being there. She had opened it because she always opened things and found 12 shelves of pre-standardization magical theory texts, a reading lamp that worked on a principle she still hadn't fully identified, and a particular quality of silence that was different from the silence of other rooms. Older, more settled, the silence of a space that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had grown patient about it. She had told no one. She had gone back regularly for 4 years. She knew, standing before the door now, with Draco's hand no longer in hers, released somewhere between the lift and the corridor by mutual, unspoken, complicated agreement, that she had told him. She didn't remember the conversation. She remembered the room instead, the way you remember a dream not in sequence, but in atmosphere. The specific amber of that lamp, the smell of texts that had been written before the modern conventions of preservation charms, the sensation of a space that felt improbably safe. She pushed the door open. The library was exactly as she'd left it, exactly as it always was. The lamp lit by whatever principle governed it, the 12 shelves standing in their patient rows, the silence complete and undemanding. And on the reading table at the center of the room, where she had spent 4 years working through theoretical texts with the focused solitude of someone who finds crowds exhausting and ideas restorative. A box. Plain, ministry standard archival cardboard. Nothing to distinguish it from the thousands of identical boxes stored in the building above and below them. But it was sealed with 2 containment charms. She felt them before she reached it. The layered, magical pressure of workmanship she recognized as her own, and beneath it a second layer, cleaner and more austere, that she recognized as something she had no right to recognize, and recognized anyway. Draco came to stand beside her. He looked at the box, and then at the table, and then at the room around them with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not in any of their 7 previous encounters, not in the 5 days of this investigation. It was the expression of someone recognizing a place they hadn't known they'd been, the specific, vertiginous quality of a memory arriving not as recollection, but as the physical response of a body that remembered what the mind did not. "You brought me here," he said, not accusatory, wondering almost. "Apparently," she said. "When?" "Before. During." She gestured at the box. Whatever the during was. She looked at the room, at the reading lamp, the shelves, the 2 chairs at the table. 2 chairs. She was nearly certain there had been one before, that one of them had brought the second from somewhere, and the specificity of that small domestic adjustment pressed against something tender in her chest. "We worked here." "Yes." He said it with the quality of a door opening slowly. "I can not remember, but something adjacent to it, the feeling of this light." He looked at the lamp, the cold from the floor. He looked down at the ancient stone beneath their feet, and she watched his face and thought about what it meant to carry the ghost of a room you couldn't enter anymore. The way a body carries the memory of warmth after the source of it has gone. She removed the containment charms, her own first, then his, placing her wand against the second layer and feeling it dissolve at her touch in a way that suggested it had been keyed to her specifically. A choice he had made. Seal it with her magic. so that she was the one who opened it. She held this thought for a moment and did not speak it aloud. Inside the box were 3 folders and a smaller sealed envelope, this one addressed in both their hands. Her name in his writing, his name in hers, the letters alternating as if they had sat together and written it simultaneously, which he rather thought they had. She set the envelope aside. The folders first, evidence before feeling, the only order she knew how to operate in. The first folder contained the documentation of what Renfrew, Vane, and Thatch had done. It was comprehensive, methodical, the kind of evidence assembly that required significant time and access, and the specific doggedness of 2 people who had decided something needed to be proven beyond all possible refutation before they acted on it. Financial records, the same ones Draco had found echoes of last night, but complete here, the full trail rather than the fragments. Correspondence, extracted from ministry archives, using authorization codes she didn't remember obtaining. A list of names, the Muggle-born witches and wizards whose registration records had been sold, 47 of them, and beside each name, a notation of what had subsequently happened to them. Harassment, threats, 2 with the notation relocated, circumstances unclear, 1 with a date and a single word she had to make herself read without flinching. Deceased. She had known this was coming. The shape of the missing thing had told her. But knowing something is coming and receiving it are, as she'd noted before, entirely different experiences. She set the first folder down. She picked up the second. The second folder contained their methodology, not the crimes, what they had done in response to the crimes. 3 operations, 1 per victim, conducted over the course of 6 weeks. The memory extractions were documented with the same rigor they'd applied to the evidence. Timing, technique, outcome. Each victim's memories had been removed with surgical precision and stored. The documentation used her personal case methodology, the unmodified version, clean and thorough and impossible to misread. They had not killed anyone. That was the first thing she confirmed, reading carefully, and the relief of it was vast and warm. They had extracted memories, left the victims physically unharmed. The cause of death, listed in the official case file, complete mnemic collapse, was not the extraction itself. The extraction had been the instrument, not the executioner. Something else had caused the collapse, something she didn't yet have a name for. She set the second folder down and looked at Draco. He had been reading alongside her, leaning in close enough to track the same pages, and she had been aware of him the way she'd been aware of the lamp, not as a distraction, as a constant, something that had become, without specific ceremony, part of the quality of the space. "We didn't kill them," he said. "No, but they died." "Yes." She picked up the third folder. "And I think this is why." The third folder was the thinnest, 3 pages only, 1 per victim, written in a hand that was neither entirely hers nor entirely his, but moved between both, as if they had written in rotation, passing the quill back and forth in the amber lamplight of this room. The pages documented what they had found inside the extracted memories, what Renfrew and Vane and Thatch had known and done and intended to continue doing. And at the bottom of each page, a single clinical notation. Memories transferred to Ministry's secure archive, reference pending. Originals unrecoverable. Subject mimetically destabilized. prognosis uncertain. She read the notation 3 times. They destabilized themselves, she said slowly. The extraction, a full extraction, everything they knew about what they'd done. It wasn't that we took too much. It's that what they knew was load-bearing. They had structured their entire cognition around the network, around the system they'd built. When we removed those specific memories, the structure collapsed, Draco said. His voice was careful, precise, the voice of someone following a logical chain and not yet deciding how he feels about where it ends. We didn't know that would happen. We didn't know, she confirmed, but we should have considered it. We were not operating under ideal conditions. No, we were operating under... She stopped. Under urgency. Under anger, probably. Under something that felt like justice and may have been partly vengeance. And I... She stopped again, more deliberately. I need to sit with that. So do I. He said it without qualification, without the deflection she might have expected, the sardonic distance, the armor of irony, just the honest acknowledgement of a person who has looked at something uncomfortable and not looked away. She sat down at the reading table. After a moment, he pulled the second chair out and sat too, across the corner of the table from her, close enough for the lamp's amber light to catch the angles of his face and render them in the particular warm chiaroscuro of a world before electric light, all shadow and glow and the things that live between them. The envelope, she said. He looked at it where she'd set it on the table beside the folders. Both their names in both their hands. He picked it up and held it for a moment without opening it, turning it over once. Not stalling, she thought. Preparing. There was a difference. He opened it and set the letter flat between them so they could both read it. The handwriting was mixed again. Sentences in her hand, sentences in his, passing back and forth with the fluid continuity of people who have stopped performing separateness. If you're here, you've read the folders. Good. We're sorry about what they showed you. We were sorry then too. What you need to understand, we were right about what they'd done. We were right that waiting would cost lives. We were not entirely right about the method. We know that now, and we expect you know it too. That's why we left it for you to find, not to absolve ourselves, to understand it properly. The memories we extracted are in Ministry Secure Archive, filed under reference 7741-M. They contain everything needed to prosecute the consortium. The remaining members, there are more than 3, are named in Vane's memories specifically. This is what we wanted to hand off. This is what we couldn't carry and report simultaneously, not without compromising the extraction method, not without exposing what we'd done to people who would have stopped us, correctly, before the evidence was complete. We are not sure we made the right choices. We are sure we made them together. There is one more thing. On the last night, the night after Thatch, the night we came back here to seal everything and begin the forgetting, something happened that had nothing to do with the case. We have not sealed this memory because it does not belong to the case. It belongs to us. You will find it intact. You have been finding it for days already, if we know ourselves at all. Don't be careful with it. There is no version of the careful approach that ends well for either of you. We know. We tried. It started, as most true things do, with honesty. We were sitting at this table. The lamp was on. The case was closed, and one of us, it doesn't matter which, said, "I did not expect you." That was all. That was enough. The rest is yours to finish. The letter ended. The lamp burned on in its amber, principled way. Outside this room, the ministry existed in its massive, ordinary complexity. Thousands of people, hundreds of cases, the full bureaucratic weight of a magical world in its daily operation. In here, there was the table, and the 2 chairs, and the lamp, and the 12 shelves of patient books, and the silence that had been holding its breath for 300 years and had grown entirely accustomed to waiting. Hermione folded the letter with steady hands. She set it in the 3rd folder with the others. She squared the corners of the stack, not because they needed squaring, but because her hands needed somewhere to be. "Reference 7741-M, she said. "We need to report it, formally, today." Yes. He was watching her hands. Hermione. She had not heard her name in his voice before. Not her first name. In their entire shared history, across all 7 previous encounters and 5 days of investigation, and a growing number of things she had no adequate category for, he had called her Granger. Always Granger. The shift was small and seismic simultaneously, the way a single altered note changes the entire quality of a chord. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression from the letter, the one it had described more precisely than she could have managed herself. Open and frightened and certain, all 3. "I did not expect you," he said. The words landed with the weight of a thing said twice. Once in this room, months ago, by a version of themselves that had trusted the future enough to leave it unsealed. And once now, by him, looking at her in the amber light of a lamp that burned on an unknown principle in a room that should not exist, with the full knowledge of everything they had done and chosen and left behind and found again. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. "Neither did I," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, and truer than she was entirely comfortable with, and, she decided, with the specific, deliberate quality of someone who has spent a lifetime being careful and has just been told twice by her own past self that the careful approach ends badly, to let it be both of those things. The lamp burned. The silence held them, warm and old and patient. Between them on the table, the letter said what it had already said. "The rest is yours to finish." The memory arrived on a Thursday, not gradually, not the slow surfacing she'd been half expecting, the way repressed things sometimes rose through sleep or the peripheral vision of an unguarded moment. It arrived all at once, the way a door opens when you finally find the right key, complete, immediate, and with the particular quality of something that had been waiting on the other side for a very long time. She was in the middle of drafting the formal report on reference 7741-M when it happened. Her quill was moving across the parchment, the replacement quill, not the one from the crime scene photograph, that one having been collected into evidence with the careful tagging of an investigator who understood that objects remembered things. And then it stopped. Not because she stopped it, because she was suddenly somewhere else entirely, and the office and the parchment and the grey morning light through the narrow window all receded simultaneously, as if someone had adjusted the distance between her and the present tense. She was in the library. The reading lamp burned its amber, principled burn. The 12 shelves stood in their patient rows. The stone floor held its deep cold against the soles of her feet. She was not wearing shoes. She registered this with the distant, clinical part of her mind that continued observing even inside recovered memory. She had removed them at some point, which meant she'd been here long enough to stop performing uprightness. Draco was across the table from her, jacket discarded over the back of his chair, his shirt sleeves turned back to the elbow with the particular practicality of someone who had stopped caring hours ago about the appearance of composure. His hair had lost whatever arrangement it normally maintained. On the table between them were the remnants of a night's work, 3 folders, a succession of notes in both their hands, 2 empty cups that had held tea at some earlier, more optimistic point in the evening. They had finished. She understood this in the memory the way she'd understood things in that time, with a bone-deep certainty that had nothing to do with relief. The case documentation was complete. The evidence was sealed. Vane's memories, containing the names of the remaining consortium members, were secured in the Ministry archive under a reference number they'd generated together, keyed to her authorization and his, requiring both to access. It was done. What came after done was the silence. Not the working silence they developed over 6 weeks of this. The particular productive quiet of 2 people whose minds ran in compatible patterns, who had stopped narrating every step to each other because narration had become unnecessary. This was a different quality of silence. The silence that fills the space when the purpose that organized a shared time is suddenly absent, and the 2 people who filled it are required to look at each other without the intermediary of work. She remembered looking at the table rather than at him. She remembered straightening a stack of notes that did not need straightening. She remembered him saying, "Granger." And she remembered looking up because he'd said her name with something in it she'd never heard before. Not the precise economy of their working relationship, not the old armor, not even the careful openness he developed over weeks of shared purpose. Something unguarded in a way that had no performance in it at all. The sound of a person who had decided, without announcement, to stop protecting a particular piece of themselves. "You should know something," he'd said. She had waited. She was good at waiting, when the thing being waited for mattered. 6 weeks ago, he'd said, when this file appeared on my desk. I nearly refused. I had the letter drafted. Consulting engagement declined. Conflict of interest. Thank you for thinking of me. He'd looked at the lamp rather than at her, which she'd understood even then was not avoidance, but the particular honesty of someone who finds direct eye contact makes truth harder, not easier. And then I read the case summary, the methodology. I recognized the pattern of thinking in it the way you recognize, the way you know a piece of music before you've consciously identified it. He'd paused. I knew it was yours, not the ministry's, yours specifically, and I found that I wanted to know why. She had sat very still. Not the case, he'd continued. I wanted to know why you'd built something that required me specifically. Why your thinking, when it constructed a problem of this magnitude, apparently included me as necessary. He'd looked at her then, and the looking had the quality she'd been accumulating without naming for 6 weeks, precise and undeflected, and carrying more than it said. I have spent a considerable amount of time being certain that I am not, to you, anything approaching necessary. The memory held the specific temperature of that moment, the amber light, the cold floor, the particular atmosphere of a room in which two people have just reached the outermost limit of the distance they were using to manage each other. She had said, "I built the case so we'd find it together. Past me did," which means past me already knew. Knew what? That you were. That this worked. She gestured at the table, the folders, the accumulated evidence of 6 weeks of seamless, exhausting, entirely improbable collaboration. That we worked, whatever that means, however it happened. She'd paused. I don't know when it happened. I do, he'd said. She'd looked at him. Week 3, he'd said. We were working on the vein documentation. It was past midnight. You'd found an inconsistency in the payment records, and you had this expression. Not the competent expression, not the investigator expression. The real one. The one you have when something has surprised you, and you're delighted about it underneath the professional attention. He'd stopped. I thought, I could look at that expression indefinitely. The silence after that had the particular weight of a true thing landing without softening. She remembered her hands on the table, her own voice, quieter than she'd intended. Week 2 for me. He'd looked at her with something she could only call startled, not that she'd spoken, but at the content of it. Week 2. You were reading the Thatch correspondence. You'd found something. I could tell by the quality of your stillness. And you looked up, and you said, very quietly, "There it is. Not to me. Just to yourself. To the room." She'd met his gaze. You looked satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with performance, nothing to do with what anyone was watching. It was entirely private, and I happened to see it. She'd paused. I thought, I have spent 7 years having a completely wrong idea of who you are. Something had moved through his face then. Not pain exactly, but the complicated cousin of it. The expression of someone receiving something they'd stopped expecting. 7 years is a long time to be wrong, he'd said. I'm generally very quick, she'd said. This was an exceptional case. And he had. She remembered this with the particular vivid clarity of a thing that had been preserved without obliviation, kept whole because neither of them could stand to lose it. He had laughed. Not the controlled, minimal version. A real laugh, surprised out of him, brief and genuine and completely unguarded, and it had changed his entire face, and she had felt it land somewhere central in her chest and stay there. Then the laugh had subsided, and they had looked at each other in its aftermath, and the distance between them across the table had undergone a qualitative change. Still the same physical measurement, but no longer the same thing. Less like a gap and more like an held breath. He had reached across the table. Slowly, not hesitantly, but with the deliberateness of someone who is entirely certain and wants that certainty to be legible. His hand had come to rest over hers on the table, the same hand that had pulled her up in the archive, but different in every other particular. His thumb had moved across her knuckle the way it had in her office yesterday morning. Once, then still. She had turned her hand over beneath his. This is, she'd started. Yes, he'd said, not knowing what she'd been going to say and not requiring it. Draco. His name in her mouth had done something to his expression. She'd watched it happen, the slight, involuntary opening of it, as if the word itself were a key to something he'd locked a long time ago out of necessity and largely forgotten how to unlock. "We're about to obliviate ourselves," she'd said. "I know." Which means, "I know," he'd said again, softer. "We won't remember this. But it will still have happened." He'd looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he'd said, "it will still have happened." She'd stood then, moving around the corner of the table, and he'd stood with her, and the motion had brought them into the proximity that all their careful professional distances had been negotiating around for weeks. She'd looked up at him. He was taller than she managed to account for every time, and the amber light had caught the grey of his eyes and turned it to something warmer. "Whatever we find," she'd said, "when we come back to this, we'll find it together," he'd said. The echo of her own words from the very beginning returned to her now with the particular resonance of something that had proven itself true. "We built it that way." She'd reached up and touched his face, just her hand against his jaw, brief and deliberate, and carrying everything she didn't have time to say before they took from themselves the memory of having said it. He turned his face slightly into her palm. His eyes had closed for a moment, one moment, private and complete. Then he'd opened them and looked at her and said, "When we find each other again." "We will," she'd said. "Granger." "We will," she'd said again, with the certainty she gave to evidence, to things that could be demonstrated. "I'll build it, so we have to." And then she had kissed him, not the cautious first kiss of two people who are uncertain, the kiss of two people who are certain and are also about to lose the memory of their certainty and need, in whatever time remains, to make it real enough to leave an impression on the body that the mind cannot later entirely dismiss. His hands had come to her face, and hers had found the front of his jacket, and the lamp had burned on in its amber, unknowing way, and the library had held them in its old and patient silence. When it ended, they had stood for a moment with their foreheads together, her hands still in the fabric of his jacket. "It will still have happened," she'd said. "Yes," he'd said, against her hair. "It will still have happened." The memory released her. She was in her office. Her quill was in her hand, hovering above the unfinished report. The grey morning light lay flat and ordinary across her desk. The replacement quill had left a slight ink mark on the parchment where it had paused. She set it down. She sat for a long moment with the memory, whole, intact, exactly as they had left it, preserved not in a sealed file or a locked box, but in the only archive that had never required a containment charm, the one that had waited, patient and warm, beneath all the careful professional distance and the evidence layouts and the cold-stoned corridors for the rest of them to catch up. She picked up her wand. She sent a memo. 3 words, "Come to the library." Then she gathered the completed draft of the formal report, put on her jacket, and went to find the second chair. He was already there when she arrived. Of course he was. She was beginning to understand that this was simply a thing about him, the way he arrived before he was expected, not from eagerness, but from the particular restlessness of someone who needed to be in a place before he could decide how to be in it. He was standing at the shelves when she pushed the door open, his back to her, one hand raised to the spine of a text she recognized from her own long hours in this room. a pre-standardization volume on cooperative spell theory, 300 years old, its cover worn to the texture of dry skin. He did not turn immediately. She did not announce herself. They had moved past the performance of those small social graces somewhere in the past week, shed them the way you shed a coat indoors. Not dramatically, simply because the temperature had changed and the coat was no longer necessary. She set her files on the table. She sat in her chair. She thought of it as hers now, the one facing the lamp, the one she had apparently occupied for 6 weeks of a shared work she was only just remembering. The lamp burned in its amber, principled way, indifferent to the fact that it was 11 in the morning and natural light existed. Draco turned. He looked at her face and went very still. "You remember," he said. Not a question. He read it in her the way he'd been reading her all week, with the specific attention of someone who had stopped managing the information they received and simply let it arrive. "All of it," she said. "This morning, while I was writing the report." He moved away from the shelves and came to the table. He did not sit immediately. He stood at the corner of it, one hand resting on its surface, looking at her with the expression she had now seen in memory and in the present simultaneously, which gave it a particular layered quality, like a chord played in 2 octaves at once. "I remembered last night," he said. I couldn't sleep. I was sitting at my desk, and it came back without warning. Everything." He paused. "I sat with it for several hours before I could move." She understood this. She had sat with it too. The full weight of 6 weeks returned all at once. The work and the evidence and the 3 victims and the amber lamp and his face turned into her palm and the specific quality of his voice saying it will still have happened. All of it arriving simultaneously and requiring, before anything else, simply to be received. "The report is drafted," she said. She placed it on the table between them. "Reference 7741-M, formally flagged. The consortium names from Vane's extracted memories, the full financial trail, the methodology, ours, documented honestly, including the outcome we didn't intend and can't undo." She had written this section 4 times before finding language that was neither self-exculpatory nor self-punishing, simply accurate. Simply the truth of what they'd done and what it had cost. "I've recommended an independent review of the extraction technique, and I've noted that the evidence obtained, however imperfectly, is complete and prosecutable." He read the relevant sections with the attention he gave everything, thorough, unhurried, missing nothing. She watched his eyes move across the parchment and thought about week 2. And there it is, and the 7 years of having a completely wrong idea about who someone was. "You named us both," he said, without looking up, "as the investigators of record." "We were," she said. "We are. Whatever we did in those rooms and whatever it cost, we did it because 47 people's names were being sold, and one of them was already dead, and the official channels would have taken 6 months we didn't have." She paused. "I will not put my name on a document that erases yours from it." He looked up then. Something moved through his face. Not the complicated cousin of pain this time. Something cleaner. Something that had the quality of a long-held tension releasing along a specific, located line. "Granger," he said. "The report stands as written," she said, because she needed to finish the thought before the expression on his face made finishing thoughts more difficult. We submit it today, together. Whatever review follows, we face it the same way we built it. Together, he said. Yes. He set the report down. He pulled out the chair, his chair, the one he had apparently occupied for 6 weeks, and sat. The table between them was smaller than her office table, the library's dimensions more intimate, and at this proximity, the lamp's warmth was tangible, the amber light doing its particular work on the space between them. "I want to say something," he said. He spoke carefully, not from hesitation, but from the deliberateness she'd learned to distinguish from it. The quality of a person choosing each word because the words matter, not because he's unsure of them. "About what I remember." She waited. "I remember week 2, he said. "You, reading the Renfrew correspondence at this table. You'd found the first financial inconsistency, and you had colour in your face. Your hair was doing something complicated. You were completely unaware of either of these things, which was..." He stopped, looked at the lamp briefly, then back at her. "It was the first time I understood that I was in significant difficulty." She felt warmth move up through her chest. "Significant difficulty," she repeated. "I am attempting to be measured about this. I can see that." Stop, almost smiling. "I'm not..." She stopped because she was, and they both knew it, and the almost smile completed itself before she could prevent it. She watched the same thing happen to his face, that brief, involuntary completion of an expression he was attempting to manage, and the managing failed. And for a moment they were simply 2 people at a table in an amber-lit room, smiling at each other without any professional architecture around it. The moment settled, became something else, not less warm, but deeper, more serious in the way that serious things are serious when they matter, rather than when they're heavy. "I remember the last night," he said quietly. "So do I." "All of it?" "Yes." She looked at him directly. "All of it." The lamp burned. Somewhere in the vast above of the ministry, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday continued. Memos and meetings, and the scratch of 1,000 quills across ministry standard parchment. In here, the air had the quality of the library's particular stillness, which was not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of a space that had learned to hold things carefully. "You kissed me," he said, as if the fact of it still had weight, arriving in the present tense after a night of sitting alone with the recovered memory. "You kissed me back," she said. "I did." He paused. "Rather thoroughly, as I recall." "That is, yes, an accurate characterization." He looked at her with something that was not quite the expression from the letter, not quite the expression from the memory. Something new, assembled from those materials, but belonging to this specific Thursday morning, this specific present tense, in which they were both entirely themselves and entirely aware of what the other one was. "We agreed then," he said, "past us, to leave that memory intact." "We couldn't lose it," she said. "We tried. I think we tried, the way we tried to seal everything else. But it wouldn't go, or we wouldn't let it." She thought about this. "I think it's possible that there are some things you simply cannot obliviate. Not because the magic fails, because the person won't allow it, even from themselves." He was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" he said. "Precisely." "It means," she said carefully, that even without the memory, we knew. That's why it was easy to find each other again in this investigation. That's why the case worked the way it worked. Why the arguments were seamless. Why the patterns fit. Why you knew to bring me tea at 7:43 in the morning. We'd removed the explicit memory. We hadn't removed... She stopped and looked at the table and said the next part to the surface of it rather than to his face, because the face made the words more difficult. What we'd become to each other, that stayed. The silence that followed was the longest they'd sat in together, and also, she thought, the most complete. Not charged with the procedural tension of an investigation or the careful management of proximity, but full in the way that silences are full when two people are in them without any pretense left. She heard his chair move. She looked up. He had come around the corner of the table. He stood before her, not crowding, not demanding, simply there, close, the amber light falling across his face in the particular way she had seen in memory, and was now seeing in the present simultaneously, and the doubling of it moved through her with a clarity that made the past week of careful distance feel both necessary and entirely finished. "Hermione," he said. Her name. The first time he'd said it had been in her office, and it had been seismic. Now it was something else, familiar, specific, spoken with the particular quality of a word that has found its right weight through use. As if he had been saying it privately, in whatever space he kept private things, and was only now letting her hear what he'd been doing. She stood. They were very close. The library held its breath, all 300 years of it, all the amber patience of the lamp, all the quiet of 12 shelves of books that had been waiting in the dark since before either of them was born. "I did not expect you," he said. The same words from the letter, from the memory, from the last night, but different in this iteration, carrying a different weight. Not the confession of a past moment, but the statement of a present truth. "I still do not expect you. I find you, every morning, unexpected and necessary, and I have stopped trying to account for it." She reached up and touched his face. The same gesture from the memory, her hand against his jaw, the specific warmth of his skin against her palm. He turned into it the same way he had then, a slight, involuntary motion, and his eyes closed for a moment that was private and complete. When he opened them, she was still there. She would, she thought, keep being there. She had built an entire case to ensure it. "We should submit the report," she said softly. "Yes," he said without moving. "And after the review, there will be hearings, probably formal proceedings. It will be complicated and public, and neither of us will enjoy it." "No," he agreed, still not moving. "And we did something that cost 3 lives we didn't intend to cost, and I will be thinking about that for a very long time." "As will I." He looked at her steadily. "And the 47 people whose names were being sold. I will be thinking about them too." She nodded. She would think about both. That was the shape of it, the full, honest weight of what they'd done, and why they'd done it. And she would not simplify it into innocence, or condemn it into pure guilt. She would think about it with the same unflinching attention she gave everything that mattered, and she suspected he would too, and that they would think about it on occasion together. "After the proceedings," he said. "When the report is submitted and the review is done, and whatever formal consequences follow have followed." "Yes," she said. "I'd like to." He stopped, the measured quality again. The deliberate choosing of words. I would like to continue finding you unexpected, if that is. She kissed him, not the way she had on the last night, not with the particular urgency of two people who are about to lose the memory of this and need it to be real enough to leave a mark. With the unhurried certainty of two people who are not going anywhere, who have all the time that the future contains, who have built something carefully and improbably across 6 weeks of recovered truth, and are now standing in it without the need to rush. His hands came to her face, the same motion, exact, as if the muscle memory of a night he'd spent months not remembering had stored itself somewhere the Obliviation couldn't reach. Her hands found the front of his jacket. The lamp burned on in its amber, principled way, which had always been its way and would continue to be, indifferent and faithful all at once. When it ended, they stood for a moment with their foreheads together, and she was aware of him breathing and the warmth of the room, and the particular quality of the present tense when it is exactly where you are supposed to be. The report first, she said. The report first, he agreed. She stepped back and looked at him, at his face in the amber light, at the expression on it that was open and unguarded and entirely, specifically his. And she thought about the file that had arrived on a Tuesday between one breath and the next, and the 2 words at the bottom of it, nearly invisible, written in a hand she hadn't recognized as her own. Find us. She had. They both had. They had followed the careful map their past selves had built through 6 weeks of recovered evidence and amber lamplight, and the slow, patient work of 2 people finding their way back to something they had never quite managed to lose. She gathered the report from the table. He held out his hand, not to take it, she understood, not to carry it for her in the manner of someone performing consideration, but the same gesture from the archive in sub-level 6. Offered, open, waiting. She took it. They left the library together, the door closing softly behind them, the lamp burning on in the empty room with the faithfulness of something that has no reason to stop. The 12 shelves standing in their patient rows, the 2 chairs at the table, the silence holding the shape of what had just been in it, warm and complete and no longer waiting. The corridor outside was ordinary. The ministry above them was ordinary. The Thursday continued in its ordinary way, entirely unaware that somewhere on sub-level 4, in a room that had no business existing, 2 people had finished something they had started a long time ago in a language they'd had to learn twice. Hermione walked beside him through the ordinary corridor, the report under her free arm, his hand around hers, and felt, not the almost something she'd been carrying since Tuesday, not the careful management of a feeling she hadn't been ready to name, but the thing itself, whole and unhurried, exactly the size it had always been. It had started with a lie, a case filed under her own name that she hadn't filed, a Tuesday morning assembled for her by a version of herself that knew something she didn't yet. It had ended, as true things do, with the simplest possible honesty. I did not expect you. Neither did I. And yet...
This story started with a simple question. What if 2 people did something brave and then forgot it, when the only way to find the truth was to find each other first? I wanted to write about trust, not the easy kind, the kind that grows slowly in silence, in small moments, in the space between two people who are both a little broken. Draco and Hermione don't fall in love because everything is perfect. They fall in love because everything is hard, and they choose each other anyway. That felt true to me. I also wanted to write about guilt, about going something for the right reason, but in the wrong way, and living with that, not running from it, because real people don't run, they stay, they look at the difficult thing, and they say, I was here, I did this, I am still here. That take courage, quiet courage, the kind nobody writes about enough. So this story is for everyone who has ever tried to do the right thing and wasn't sure if they succeeded. It's for everyone who found someone unexpected and almost walked away. And it's for everyone who believes that some things are too true to forget, even when you try. Thank you for listening.